Do you want to learn how to create this cool live action to animation thing? This tutorial is for you. We're diving into EBsynth, style transfers, drawing this whole thing, synthing this whole thing, getting the final look and feel to go from video to animation in record time. So we're kicking things off by finding our footage, and I've headed on over to pexels.com, really great site to find free stock footage that you can use, and I'm looking for footage that has the subject matter framed completely in the shot, so nothing is running in and out of screen. I can just look at this shot, a woman in this case on a chair. Kick things off by just doing a bit of motion tracking. So there's many different ways of doing motion tracking. You can stabilize the motion, you can track certain points, you can do planar tracking using Mocha, and you can get very advanced. But for this, all we really want to do is we want to get rid of the handheld movement of the original footage. And we do that by stabilizing the footage. I'm tracking 1 point for position, another point for rotation. And I'm trying to find high contrast spots here, the way that this pixel tracker works in After Effects. And then I hit play. So what this is doing is that it's analyzing every single frame and it's trying to stick these tracking markers onto the footage in the area that I placed them. And we got the foot almost moving into our tracking marker here. It doesn't seem to disturb it, so that's all good. Sometimes you can get a little bit of jittery motion when working with the trackers. You want to watch out for things popping in and out of your tracking zone. So we'll just hit apply, and that has now been applied to our footage. It's added all of these keyframes to our footage, but really what it's done is it's just centered our footage. So now the subject matter itself and the thing that we tracked is fully centered. And I'll change my background color to red so you can see what has now happened. The edge of my original footage seemed to be moving around, and it's revealing the original background, which is transparent or red in this case, just so I can see what's happening. So now with that fixed, we'll just go ahead and render out our footage, and to use EBsynth we need a PNG sequence. So that's what I'm going to select, and I'm just going to put all of those into a folder with their full resolution, and we'll just hit go. Render, 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 render. All right, now we're getting artsy. So what we'll do is we'll just look through our PNG sequence and we'll pick one frame that we want to select as our original keyframe. So I'll just select one that in general reveals sort of the most important key pose of the original footage. So we'll base everything off this one. I just go ahead and So from here, I'll just fill my entire background with a certain color, in this case white, to have enough contrast and to be able to see through my original footage, which is just a still image on top with the opacity lowered. And then I'll create a new layer. So I'm kicking things off by focusing on the skin. And you can do this in 1,000 different ways. The approach that I'm going for is that I'm actually using the lasso tool to draw my shapes, and then I will fill them with my skin color a little bit later on. But you can use the pen tool, you can use the brush tool, you can use the magnetic lasso. Artists in general can have conversations about tracing. Is it cheating? Is it not cheating? Maybe that conversation is a little bit less relevant with AI coming along, but it's a conversation that artists have had for a very long time. Is it cheating to use reference? Is it cheating to trace the reference? The specific thing about this workflow is that you kind of have to trace it, because what we're doing is we're creating one single keyframe that we're drawing in Photoshop, and we're then going to be applying that keyframe to the entire footage for this whole scene. And that's why I want to select a piece of footage where movements and changes in perspective and that kind of stuff isn't too extreme, because that will break the illusion or force you to do more work and add more and more keyframes. And we're kicking this off by doing a single keyframe now, but later on you will see that one keyframe is not going to be enough for this clip. Even though it's a fairly simple one, we will end up needing several keyframes to really make this clip work the way we want it to. So with all of my skin parts selected, I just go ahead and fill that with a color. In this case, I've selected a purple color that I think is gonna look nice for the skin. And then I select a new color, a bright pinkish red color that I'm gonna use for the shirt. So I'm sticking with a reddish purple-ish color palette that I'm gonna end up using for this clip, and making the skin purple, making the clothing pinkish. And we just use the exact same process here by using the lasso tool to select all the different shapes that have to do with the clothing, and then I'm gonna be filling those shapes with the color. So I'm using Shift to add on more selections to my already existing selection, and then I just fill, and if I make any mistake, I can use Alt to just erase parts that I've selected. And now we're diving into the hair. I'm gonna start off by creating a new layer and just fill a simple shape with the lasso tool. But then I wanna introduce a little bit of more analog and organic texture to her hair. And I'm trying out a couple different brushes that I think is gonna look nice for the way that her hair looks. So we got one with a little bit of texture here. Gonna try out a different one. Maybe that one looks good. So I like this brush, and I'm just enabling the image again because I don't want to guess what her hair silhouette is going to look like. I am free to make adjustments, and I don't have to follow every single pixel directly of what the original footage looks like, but I want to have it as a little bit of a reference to make sure that I'm not coloring wildly outside of the lines or not filling the entire shape of her hair. The closer you stick to the original source, the better EBsynth is going to work, but you still want to be able to have your creativity, of course. So now I'm doing a new layer for the hair, and this is the hair that's going to be in front of her face. So I have basically this simple hair shape, then I'm doing a bit of texture and organic hand-drawn stuff to that, and then on top of the skin I'm adding a separate layer for the hair just to be able to draw on top of her face to not have a clean of an outline and separation between hair and skin. All right, next shape, and now we're moving into the chair. And because the chair is not organic, it is actually a man-made object, I'm using another version of the lasso tool instead, where I can just click on different parts and I can have hard, sharp corners like this instead of drawing everything by hand. And I find that this just helps me to be able to work on more architectural objects like a chair, a table, a building. So I'm just holding down Shift, creating new shapes, building on top of my selection, and I want to fill everything for this chair across this entire layer, just so I have everything collected on one layer. And there we go. So now we go ahead and we select a darker purple-ish color, and I want to add a little bit of detail to this chair so it's not fully solid in one color. And I'm using this as actually the highlight color. So I'm looking at my original footage through my illustrations, and I'm seeing where all of the different highlight shapes fall across this chair silhouette to be able to add a little bit more depth to it. And you're free to have as many different layers, as many different selections, as much detail as you want at this stage. It's really about experimenting, trying things out, and then seeing how well that's going to work with EBsynth. Because like everything AI related, it's a little bit of a black box of how things are going to work, if things are going to work. The benefit is that you don't have to draw every single frame by frame the old-fashioned way. The downside is that it's a little bit of a guessing game of what the end result is going to look like. And sometimes you end up creating a keyframe and doing this whole process for a clip, and you bang your head against the wall, you try to get it to work, you do 5, 10 different keyframes like this for a single shot, but still you end up in a situation where it doesn't really work due to the way that the footage is or the way that you've drawn your keyframes and that kind of stuff. So to add a little bit more detail to this, so I don't just have flat solid colors, I want to go ahead and add some shading. So I've created a new layer. I'm currently in the process of going through and selecting various shapes across her shirt that are going to work well as the shadow layer. So I'm still using the lasso tool, I'm still holding down Shift to select different parts, and I'm able to just go through her dress and just look at the different shapes that I think look interesting and add the right level of depth and add the right shape to her clothing to make things make sense even in a minimalistic scaled back visual style. And with that, I just go ahead and fill, and you'll see that I'm now changing between different blending modes. I like to try out a couple different ones, seeing which ones I like, and then from there I can also adjust the color to end up with a result that I think works well. And then I alt-click on the line between my clothing and where my shadow layer is to create a clipping mask. So the shadows are only visible inside of her clothing. And now I'm gonna go ahead and do the exact same process, but on her skin. So I'm creating a new layer above her skin using the lasso tool, holding down Shift to be able to create several different lasso selections across this layer. And then once I'm done, I have everything that I need selected, then I can go ahead and just fill my layer with a color that I select. On the face, I want to be a little bit careful about my selection. The issue with working in a simplistic scaled back style like this is that adding too much detail is going to end up not really working, especially when you're working with faces of people. So you do want to be a little bit careful about how much detail you're adding in there. We want to keep the shadows simple, but we want to use them in a way where they add shape and form to the design. So I've just created a clipping mask. I'm lowering the opacity to get a feel for how I think that my shadows work across her face and across her entire body. We'll go ahead and use one of the blending modes, lower the opacity even more. We're keeping things fairly subtle here, but it adds a lot of detail to the final end result. And now we're heading back to the brush tool, and we're gonna go ahead and we're actually gonna draw some shapes on top of our shadow shapes, but we're using the brush tool instead to be able to add more organic hand-drawn feel to the final end result. So I'm playing around with different sizes, different brushes, messing around to get a look that I like, and then I can dive in and add a bunch of details to my illustration. So I'm kind of using this layer just to separate shapes from each other. And you can see I don't care about coloring inside of the lines because I know that I'm going to end up using a clipping mask for this layer as well. But I'm using it as a way of separating her thighs from the legs that are in the front and the back to be able to have a little bit more depth to our illustration. Because again, we are working in a simplistic, scaled back visual look and feel, but we still want to be able to add depth to it and make it feel rich and nice. And now we're heading off to the face. We're drawing the same, with the same brush, we're drawing all of the different details like her eyebrows, her eyeliner, her eyelashes. We're doing small lines for the corners of her mouth. And we're using this brush as a way of adding focused contrast to specific areas. And if you're used to working in 3D, you can think of this as kind of an ambient occlusion pass where we're drawing all of these small little crevices where we want to have that very sharp black shadow. So we're adding things like the nostrils, and we're going to go ahead and add more details to the face. In this case, I'm just drawing the whites of the eyes on a separate layer, and I want to go ahead and draw the mouth as well. So I'm using the same white color just as a single block of teeth, very cartoony, very scaled back. And then I want to add some lips to her as well. Using the lasso tool here as well, I find that this is a good way of establishing shapes like this that I can then always go back and adjust with the lasso tool to add more to the shape or take away things from the shape. I can also use the brush tool to add finite details to it if I want to. And I'm able to use both of these tools together to figure out a good, simple, nice looking shape for the mouth, for the lips, and for the teeth. And I'm always turning the reference layer on and off to be able to compare with my original illustration. Again, we don't want to get overly creative and stray too far away from the original image, not because we're not allowed to from a creative level, but because we're not allowed to from a technical level. The way that EBsynth works is with the style transfer process of transferring a single drawn keyframe on top of the video footage. The closer you match everything, the better the end result is going to work. And finally, we're adding a bit of highlights to her skin, just using a brighter version of the skin color. I'm able to input a couple of highlights here and there to make the skin feel a bit more real but I also toned down the opacity to not have her be overly shiny and look like she's made of plastic. Adding small details like the earrings, just turning off the background layer, having a look at the full thing zoomed out to get a sense of what it looks like. And with that, I feel like we're ready to go. We can export this both as a PSD file, so I can open it back up later if I want to, but also a PNG. And now we're synthing, so we're kicking up EBsynth or EBsynth. I'm not actually sure how you're supposed to pronounce it, but I'll go with EBsynth. I think that sounds better. What we do is we just drag in the entire video folder and the entire keyframes folder onto the right proportions of the software itself. Then we can open up the advanced settings. I like to max out the mapping. I think that tends to work better. And I'll also change the synthesis detail to high. This can be a very long process, or it can run fairly quickly, but we'll just have to let it take its time, and then we're ready to import that new folder into After Effects to check what it looks like. I'll just go ahead and make sure that my frame rate is the same from my imported sequence as it is with the original footage. In this case, I need 25 frames per second. So we'll just change that, and then we can drag our image sequence into a new composition and have a look at our EBsynthed result. And you see, things look kind of weird in the beginning, but then it starts to look a little bit better. We have some weird stuff happening on the right side of the screen, and then towards the end, her face kind of disappears as well. And this is usually what the process is like. You have a certain frame that you start off with, and then everything else around it, depending on the movement of the original footage and how much it varies from your source, the result can be wildly different. So what you do is you go through the footage, you find different frames that feel like a good representative for a different key pose, and then you fix those issues in Photoshop. So here I'm selecting frame 175, and then I'm selecting frame 0, the very first one. I'm dragging those into Photoshop. I'm using the images created by EBsynth, so I'm not going back from the beginning and creating completely new frames from scratch, because those would end up being fairly different from the keyframe we created before. I'm using the EBsynth result, importing a few frames, in this case frame 0, frame 175, and I want to make adjustments to those frames, then EBsynth that again, check the result, make adjustments, and you'll just go back and forth like that to make the end result look good. So what I've done here is I've just imported those two frames, and I've also imported my PSD file, because that allows me to open up the original layer stack of the keyframe we just created and make adjustments and pick specific opacity numbers, pick specific blending modes and that kind of stuff, instead of just looking at the PNG. And I like to keep several of these images up at the same time. Like here, I'm looking at the face across all three of them, and I'm able to compare everything of these new frames to the original one on the far right side of the screen. And that means that I can work on specific elements of the image at the same time, like the lips, like the eyes, like the eyelashes, and make sure that I'm using the same color, but also keeping its style consistent. And sometimes it's just easier to draw everything over again, like I'm doing here with the clothing. I filled the entire shape of her clothing with the original clothed color. Then I'm creating a new layer and I'm using those shadow shapes again, but redoing it from scratch because the end result from EBsynth ended up looking so muddy and jumbled together. Sometimes it's easier to just delete that, start over, fill it in again. I'm doing a similar process here with the skin. And just making sure that what you're doing is that you're going in and fixing things on these two images to stay consistent with the original keyframe that we created, that we spent a lot more time on creating it from scratch. We're now able to use these frames as a starting point, even if they have a lot of issues, instead of having to create 3 frames completely from scratch. And now we've imported those sequences to After Effects again. We're having a look and comparing them and doing the same process over again, checking the final result, seeing where do we have issues across our timeline. Selected frame 89, we've selected another frame, looking at it again, seeing like in the end, everything looks kind of good, but the face is kind of weird. So maybe I just need to fix that. And then I'm importing the exact same frame on top of these images, just lowering the opacity so I have a clear reference, and doing the same process here again, where I'm looking at 3 frames, 89, 242, and 425, just looking at how can I make adjustments to these frames to fix obvious issues and make sure that they stay consistent, and include important details like sometimes the face gets kind of weird because she's turning her face or something is happening in the footage that means that the original keyframe that we had before ends up not really working at that angle, and we just need to do a little bit of tweaking here and there to fix the issues. And this is the process that EBsynth recommends as well. You don't want to go ahead and just create 5 frames from the beginning, because you want to create that for a single keyframe, run it through EBsynth, see where the issues actually pop up, and then take that end result, import it back into Photoshop, and make adjustments to the frames where you notice obvious issues that you want to fix. And with that, we're ready to do our final EBsynth. And you can see my folder here of 9 keyframes in this case. I'm just going through them one by one. So all of these keyframes are created using the same process, where we started off with one single keyframe, did an EBsynth on that, checked the result, did some fixes, EBsynth again, did some fixes, and now we have a folder of 9 keyframes in this case. And I can just drag everything in, and now I get this view of the software. We can see where the keyframes start and stop between the different folders that are being created here. And now there's a very nice button in here called Export to AE, and I can just check my frame rate, change that to 25 to make sure it's the same as the original footage, export, and that will push the whole thing into a single composition featuring all my image sequences that have been created from EBsynth, and they will have opacity keyframes on top of themselves where they fade in and out of the different synths basically. What I want to do here is I want to go ahead and create a matte for my original footage. And you can do this by using a tool like Runway ML or using the roto brush. In this case, because I have a background that's fairly the same color throughout the entire thing, it's pretty bright. I'm just using the Luma key to be able to key out all of the things that are white in that original footage. And then I'm pre-composing that as my video matte. But you will also see that there's a few issues in there, like her face. Because there are highlights on her face, it's also removing those elements and making those pure red at the moment, because I'm looking through the transparency. So what I want to do is I want to create a duplicate version of my footage, remove the Luma key, and now I have to do a little bit of manual rotoscoping where I'm creating a mask to include the elements like her face, like the highlights on her face, and I can just mask her very easily like this. And the reason why we're doing this is that we want to use the original footage on top of our EBsynthed material to create a matte that only shows the animations where they're supposed to be showing. So we have a clear outline and a clear silhouette of her in the original footage because I selected a piece of footage with a very simple background. This is just a nice way of making sure that we're using that matte to cancel out all of the EBsynth animation where it shouldn't show up, basically. And again, this is a little bit of mindless work where you can put on a podcast, you can just go through and mask it like this. I could have used the roto brush, I could have used a more sophisticated version of doing rotoscoping and masking her out of the original footage. But honestly, I thought I wasn't going to need to do this step at all. And that's usually the way it goes for these EBsynth animation experiments that I do, is I try to do minimal effort to get a cool result. And then sometimes you do need to spend a little bit of extra time during that process to do some of the boring stuff. But we are still using EBsynth to be able to do cool animation where I don't need to draw every single frame by frame the old-fashioned cell animated way. And now I can just use that matte on top of my video footage using a stencil alpha. So I'm just going through, making some adjustments to the footage. I'm changing some of the fade in and fade out keyframes that EBsynth has automatically created, just to see where I can make improvements to my synth result without needing to go back and make more keyframes, because that's kind of the whole idea, is that you want to limit the amount of keyframes that you need to create, just to not overly annoy yourself with more work that you need to do than you have to, and then you use EBsynth and various After Effects techniques to be a little bit more clever about it. And in this case, I had a bit of an issue with color showing up between her body and her arm for a few frames, and instead of going back and trying to adjust that in the Photoshop stage or anywhere else, I can just create a quick shape layer, and I can frame by frame animate the path and then use that as a matte for the layer underneath it. So you'll see what happens here is that the arm and the body kind of bleeds together, and I'm just using those path keyframes to move that shape sort of where it would end up being. And because this is a fairly quick movement, that's all going to be fine, and I can just use silhouette alpha on that layer, affecting everything below it to create that hole between the body and the arm and make a nice clean line instead of having the weird shapes in there. Same thing on the right side of the screen. We have a little bit of weird stuff going on the right side, and I just create a shape covering that whole section and then using that as a silhouette alpha as well to make sure that everything that is inside of that rectangle doesn't show up. So now we'll just go ahead and finalize this whole thing. So depending on what you want to do with it, this stage could be taking very long, or it could be fairly quick. We're gonna stick with something pretty simple for now, and that's a lot of the look and feel that I like for these types of experiments, where the character itself has a lot of the detail, even though we're working in a minimalistic, saturated, sort of scaled back, cool style, very similar to the way that I work in illustration. That's been kind of my whole idea for why I wanted to do EBsynth animations like this, is that it allows me to work in a similar style that I'd like to work in for static illustrations, but in animations, instead of spending a bunch of time creating complex character rigs and doing frame by frame animations that are very complex and take a lot of time. This is a neat way of using weird tech solutions like EBsynth to be able to do that look and feel without spending thousands of hours on it. So what I'm doing here is I've just added a very quick orange background, very saturated, but I like the way that it contrasts with the pink and purple hues. And now we're back to the toe issue that I mentioned from the very beginning. All I'm doing here is I'm animating a shape layer to follow where those toes would end up, but they aren't there because they ended up going off the screen of my original footage all the way back to the pixels stage. So the footage that I downloaded was 9:16 vertical format, and that actually had her foot going slightly out of screen, which is fine if you're sticking to a vertical format, but here I've changed it to a 16:9 perspective to have that widescreen look. And now I've added a plugin called VC Reflect, which is from Video Copilot. It is a very quick and easy way to add a reflection that has much more settings in there than you would generally get if you were to just take the layer, duplicate it, flip it upside down and add a blur to it. With VC Reflect, you get a lot more control over the blur, the color, the blending modes, and all that kind of stuff to be able to create a pretty cool end result that adds that finishing touch to it, where it doesn't just end up being fairly simple scaled back visual look and feel. That little reflection in there, depending on what you think of how it's going to fit with the overall style, can add a lot more detail and visual interest to a piece like this. I don't use it for everything, but it is a easy crutch to lean back on to just get that final end result that looks crisp and nice. And now we can just look back at the full thing. We could have added a billion layers in the background. We could have added lens flares. We could have added layers in the foreground, in the background, in and out of focus. There's a ton of different things that you can do to something like this. And that's also the cool part, is that it's very much up to you how much time you want to spend on both the keyframe stage in Photoshop but also the final compositing stage where we're putting together all the final details. All right, and that's it. This is the basics of EBsynth and the workflow that I use for a lot of these animations that I've created over the years. A few of them are up on my YouTube channel, a few of them are in different places, but it's about finding footage that's going to be relevant and easy to use, creating keyframes, running that through EBsynth, doing a little bit of compositing, doing a little bit of fixing and tweaking and thingy things to get that cool end result that's really hard to replicate in any other way than working this way. If you want to know more about EBsynth, what I'm doing on this channel, subscribe, stick around, like, ding ding ding,
Perfect.
and see ya!